was gambling a long time ago.
The poker public to get some answers to questions that they deserve to have answered. For them to get some facts that have obviously not been shared with them over the last 15 months.
When I was in school, other people were thinking about how to get into the best college. What was the best program for them? I was thinking about how I could make my first millions.
Did you know that one of the greatest poker players of all time went completely broke? Despite winning millions at the table, he had almost nothing left by the end. No bankroll, no assets, and no way back into the high-stakes games he once dominated. He lost everything. But before we get to that, let's start with another poker legend who once played in the biggest cash games in the world, only to find himself struggling just to pay his bills.
The thing is to stay in the moment and not worry about the bad luck that you've had. Just control the things that you can control.
At his peak, Erick Lindgren wasn't just a poker pro. He was one of the faces of the game, charismatic, ultra-competitive, and armed with a natural ability to read opponents. He seemed like one of the few players who had it all figured out. A World Series of poker bracelet, multiple World Poker Tour titles, and deep runs in the highest stakes cash games. He was a full-tilt, poker-sponsored pro during the golden era of televised poker, earning not just from his results, but also from his association with one of the biggest poker sites in the world. He wasn't just playing for millions, he was making millions. And yet, despite all of that, the story of Erick Lindgren is not one of sustained success, but of a slow-motion financial implosion, because while he may have been great at making money, he was even better at losing it. And when the losses started piling up, they didn't just threaten his bankroll, they swallowed him whole. Lindgren's downfall wasn't one cataclysmic event. There was no single hand where he shoved all in and torched his fortune. Instead, it was death by 1,000 bad decisions. It wasn't just poker that drained him, it was everything else. He was a sports bettor who didn't know when to quit. He was a gambler who chased losses. He was a guy who at one point was reportedly borrowing six-figure sums just to stay afloat. And, as it turns out, the debts were more than just poker table gossip. By the time Black Friday hit in 2011, Lindgren was already in trouble. The Full Tilt poker fallout exposed just how deeply in debt he was, not just to the site, but to fellow pros who had been fronting him money. Players started coming forward, claiming Lindgren owed them staggering amounts. And as the story spread, the numbers became almost impossible to process. 7 figures, 8 figures. At one point, it was revealed that he had received a $2 million wire transfer from Full Tilt by mistake. And instead of returning it, he gambled it away. The walls were closing in. His reputation in the poker community went from respected pro to someone you definitely don't lend money to. Lawsuits followed. His name became synonymous with bad debt. In 2012, he finally admitted he had a serious gambling addiction. In 2013, he filed for bankruptcy. The guy who had once been at the top of the game, the one who lived the dream that so many poker players chase, had lost it all. And the worst part, he wasn't the only one. Because Lindgren's story, as shocking as it is just one example of how quickly fortune can turn in poker. Some players lose it at the table, others lose it away from the felt. But no matter how they get there, the destination is always the same, rock bottom, and few hit it as hard as the next name on this list.
Well, I was gambling a long time ago, playing all sorts of rummy card games, and one day a friend told me, hey, come and try this poker, and I did. That was, I don't know, 18 years ago or something, and I started and never looked back.
David Benyamine was the kind of player who could make poker look effortless. A former professional tennis player turned high-stakes crusher, he had a natural instinct for the game, a fearless style, and a bankroll to back it up. During the golden years of online poker, he was a regular in the nosebleed cash games on Full Tilt Poker, battling legends like Phil Ivey, Patrick Antonius, and Tom Dwan for six-figure pots on a nightly basis. At his peak, he had it all. World Series bracelets, million-dollar swings, and a seat in the biggest games on the planet. But just like so many before him, the higher he climbed, the further he had to fall. Benyamine's story is one of quiet collapse. While some poker players crash out in spectacular fashion, public scandals, lawsuits, or shocking betrayals, his downfall was more subtle, more drawn out. There wasn't a single moment where everything unraveled, but rather a slow and painful bleed that left him in a position no one expected, completely broke. His first downfall came from something that should have ended his career before it even started. He was playing high-stakes poker without actually knowing the rules. When Benyamine first sat down in some of the biggest Omaha games in the world, he was still learning the format. That would be like someone walking onto center court at Wimbledon and figuring out how to hit a backhand in real time. And yet, despite this, he won. He thrived. He was a fast learner, and once he caught up, he became a monster in the 4-card game, wrecking opponents who had spent years studying it. But while his poker instincts were sharp, his discipline was not. Like many other high-stakes players of that era, Benyamine wasn't just gambling at the poker table. He was gambling everywhere. He had a well-documented sports betting habit, and it wasn't just for fun. This wasn't throwing a few bets on a football match for entertainment. He was playing the kind of numbers that could bury anyone, even someone with his level of success. The line between being rich and being in massive debt was razor thin, and Benyamine walked it without caution. Black Friday was the first major hit. When Full Tilt Poker went under, Benyamine, like many others, lost a massive portion of his bankroll. The safety net was gone. The regular stream of high-stakes action had dried up, and the ecosystem that had once made him millions no longer existed. But instead of adjusting, he tried to chase. His gambling habits never stopped, and when the games weren't running, he had to find action elsewhere. That search for action slowly drained him over time, leaving him in a worse and worse position. By the mid-2000s teens, the nosebleeds weren't calling his name anymore. The 7-figure swings that were once routine had become impossible to sustain. The reality hit. He was broke. And unlike some of the players on this list, there wasn't a redemption arc. No miraculous comeback, no high-profile return to the scene, just a slow fade from the top, a quiet exit from the games that made him a fortune and then took it all back. And while Benyamine's story is one of slow decline, others weren't so lucky. Some lost everything in an instant. One bad decision, one mistake that couldn't be undone. And that's exactly what happened to the next player on this list.
It was a pretty simple process. We knew that just because Party Poker left, that doesn't mean that it was the correct decision to leave or that we were the same as Party Poker.
Few names in poker history have fallen as hard as Howard Lederer. At one point, he wasn't just a poker pro. He was the poker pro, a 2-time World Series of poker bracelet winner, a respected high-stakes player, and one of the most influential figures in the game. He wasn't just competing in poker, he was helping run it. As one of the key figures behind Full Tilt Poker, Lederer had positioned himself as both an elite player and a powerful businessman, sitting at the center of one of the biggest poker sites in the world. And then, in an instant, it all came crashing down. Lederer's story isn't about bad bankroll management, it isn't about degeneracy, sports betting, or reckless gambling. It's about something far worse, betrayal. Because when Full Tilt Poker collapsed on Black Friday, it wasn't just a company that went under, it was millions of dollars in player funds that vanished into thin air. And at the center of it all, Howard Lederer. For years, Full Tilt had operated as one of the biggest poker sites on the planet. It was a behemoth, backed by some of the game's most recognizable faces, including Phil Ivey, Tom Dwan, and Patrick Antonius. Players trusted it, poured money into it, and for a long time, it worked, until it didn't. Because behind the scenes, the company wasn't just paying out winnings, it was paying salaries. Massive, 7-figure salaries to the people running it, including Lederer. By the time the US government shut the site down in 2011, Full Tilt didn't have the money to cover player balances. The number, over $300 million, thousands of players were locked out of their accounts, unable to withdraw their funds. Some had their entire bankrolls trapped, and when the truth came out that Lederer and other top executives had been paying themselves millions while the site was essentially running on empty, his legacy was destroyed overnight. The poker community turned on him instantly. The guy who had once been a respected figure in the game was now seen as a villain, a fraud, a man who had stolen from the very players who had built Full Tilt into what it was. Lawsuits followed, his name became toxic. He went from playing the biggest games in the world to disappearing entirely, a self-imposed exile from the poker world that he once controlled. When he finally reappeared, years later, the reception was exactly what you'd expect. Pure hostility. Players wanted nothing to do with him. His attempts to make a return to the game were met with backlash at every turn. It didn't matter that the US government had eventually bailed out Full Tilt's players, reimbursing them for a settlement with PokerStars. The damage was done. Howard Lederer didn't go broke in the way most poker pros do. He wasn't a victim of variance or of a bad run, or even of his own reckless decisions at the table. He lost everything because of greed, because of arrogance, and because in the end he made one fatal mistake. believing that he could get away with it. But while Lederer's fall from grace was tied to a single scandal, others lost their fortunes in ways that were far more personal. Some players weren't taken down by corporations or the government, they were taken down by their own demons. And the next player on this list is proof of that.
50-100 action online with Joey Sweetpea, who lost $330,000 in a day or couple days. You know, he was the guy who finished second place in the W Coupe main event for $1.1 million.
Matt Marafioti's story isn't just about losing money, it's about losing control. Because while most poker pros who went broke can at least point to something tangible, bad investments, bankroll mismanagement, a single disastrous downswing, Marafioti's downfall was far messier. His was a story of paranoia, self-destruction, and ultimately tragedy. At one point, he was one of the most feared young players in the game, a high-stakes online grinder turned live tournament threat. Marafioti had the kind of talent that made the game look unfair. He was sharp, aggressive, and completely fearless, taking on some of the best in the world and often coming out on top. Millions of dollars in earnings, the kind of confidence that made opponents second-guess their own decisions. And of course, the lifestyle that came with it. Designer clothes, VIP parties, a constant parade of Instagram-worthy moments. But for all his talent, there was always something bubbling beneath the surface, something unstable. Unlike other pros who treated poker as a business, managing variance, studying strategy, protecting their bankroll, Marafioti lived like a rock star, and not the kind who had longevity. He spent money as fast as he made it, constantly in search of the next thrill, the next big win, the next high. And when the losses came, as they always do in poker, the cracks started to show. His personality was just as volatile as his bankroll. He had a reputation for feuding with other players, getting into public arguments, and burning bridges at an alarming rate. The poker world has seen plenty of eccentric personalities, but Marafioti's wasn't just eccentric, it was erratic. Over time, his presence in the game became less about his results and more about his drama. And then, things took a dark turn. Marafioti became convinced that he was being watched, that there was a conspiracy against him. He started making bizarre social media posts, claiming that he was being followed by shadowy figures, that his phone was being tapped, that his life was in danger. At first, people assumed it was just another episode of his over-the-top personality, another example of his inability to separate reality from spectacle. But it didn't stop. The paranoia only grew. He withdrew from poker, isolating himself more and more. The money was gone, the games were gone, and eventually, so was his grip on reality. In the end, the story of Matt Marafioti didn't end at a poker table. It ended in the worst way imaginable. In 2021, he was found dead after falling from the 28th floor of a high-rise apartment in New Jersey. Authorities ruled it a suicide. The poker world has seen plenty of players go broke, plenty of players who made mistakes, lost their bankrolls, and were forced to rebuild. But Marafioti's downfall was something else entirely. It was a reminder that, for some, the game isn't just about winning and losing money, it's about stability, about control, and when that slips away, the consequences go far beyond a dwindling bankroll. But while Marafioti's story was tragic, others were simply brutal. Some players weren't taken down by paranoia or personal demons. They were taken down by cold, hard reality. And few know that better than the next name on this list.
I'm not very lucky in these kind of situations. Oh man, Bill, what's going on here? Don't send me home with the 10-9.
Jean-Robert Bellande was never the best poker player in the world. He didn't need to be. He had something arguably more valuable, a talent for survival. While other players meticulously studied solvers, analyzed hand histories, and built sustainable bankrolls, Bellande thrived on something different, an uncanny ability to keep finding action no matter how many times he went broke. His nickname, Broke Living JRB, wasn't just a gimmick, it was his entire poker career condensed into 3 words. At his peak, Bellande was a character straight out of a poker movie. He played in the biggest games, rubbed shoulders with billionaires, and somehow always seemed to be just one session away from turning it all around. He had deep runs in tournaments, high-stakes cash game appearances on TV, and a larger-than-life personality that made him a fan favorite. But behind the bravado, the reality was far less glamorous. Bellande was the embodiment of what happens when someone plays poker without a safety net. Most pros treat their bankroll like a business, separating living expenses from poker funds, ensuring that variance doesn't wipe them out overnight. Bellande played without that kind of structure. He wasn't just a high-stakes player, he was a gambler in every sense of the word, someone willing to take enormous risks, always believing that the next big score was around the corner. And sometimes it was, but it never lasted. Brad Booth wasn't just a poker pro, he was a legend of the underground high-stakes scene, a fearless cash game specialist who made his name in the backroom games of Canada before taking on the biggest sharks in the world. At his peak, he was battling Phil Ivey, Patrick Antonius, and the best of the best, playing in games where a single pot could be worth more than most people make in a year. He had the classic qualities of a high-stakes crusher, an unshakable presence, an ability to read situations with near superhuman precision, and a stomach for massive swings. But like so many before him, it didn't last. Because while most poker pros go broke due to bad bankroll management or ill-advised gambling, Booth's story had an added layer of cruelty. He wasn't just wiped out by variance or reckless decisions, he was cheated. In the mid-2000s, Booth was a dominant force in the biggest live and online games. He had the talent, the bankroll, and the respect of his peers. But in poker, all it takes is one bad move to send a career spiraling. And Booth made that move when he became a victim of the Absolute Poker super user scandal. The scam was as simple as it was devastating. Certain insiders at Absolute Poker had access to real-time hole cards, giving them the ability to see their opponent's hands as they played. It was the kind of advantage that made losing impossible, and Booth, like many others, was completely unaware. He played huge pots against opponents who knew what he had. He was being set up, hand after hand, to lose. And when it was all said and done, he had lost millions. Most players, after something like that, would walk away. But Booth wasn't most players. He tried to rebuild, taking shots at high-stakes live games to claw his way back. But the problem wasn't just the money, it was the trust. Poker is a game of deception, but only within the rules. When that line gets crossed, it changes everything. Booth wasn't just battling against the best anymore. He was battling against a game that had turned against him. The losses piled up, and the safety net was gone. No sponsorships, no backing deals, just a desperate attempt to regain what had been stolen. He went from playing the biggest games in the world to borrowing money just to stay in action. He made one last effort to rebuild his career, but by the early 2000s and 10s, it was clear. The magic was gone. Booth disappeared from the poker world, leaving behind one of the most tragic tales the game has ever seen. But for Booth, losing everything wasn't just about the money. It was about what poker took from him. His confidence, his reputation, and ultimately, his identity. He was a high-stakes warrior who had spent years fighting at the top, only to be taken out not by a bad beat, but by outright fraud. And while Booth's story is one of betrayal, others lost everything in ways that were even more brutal. Because some players weren't just victims of the system, they were victims of their own inability to stop. And no one fits that description better than the next player on this list. Gavin Griffin was never supposed to be a cautionary tale. He was supposed to be one of poker's greatest success stories, a prodigy who conquered the game at an age when most players were still grinding micro stakes. At 22, he became the youngest player to ever win a World Series of Poker bracelet. A few years later, he cemented his place in history by completing poker's rarest achievement, the Triple Crown. Winning the World Series of Poker, the European Poker Tour, and the World Poker Tour, that's a legacy most players can only dream of. Griffin did it before his 30th birthday. He wasn't just good, he was dominant. A technically sound, fearless player with the ability to shift gears seamlessly, adapting to any opponent, any table dynamic, any stakes. He won a European Poker Tour title in Monte Carlo, crushing a final table packed with killers and taking home a massive first place prize. Then, as if to prove it wasn't a fluke, he followed it up with a World Poker Tour victory, outplaying another field of elite competition. At that point, it seemed inevitable. Griffin was going to be a superstar for decades. But poker doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't reward potential. It only rewards discipline. And that was the part Griffin never fully mastered. While some of the game's greats understood the importance of bankroll management, Griffin's approach was more reckless. He played in the biggest games, took massive shots, and lived the kind of lifestyle that most people only see in movies. And when the inevitable downswings came, they didn't just hurt, they buried him. The problem wasn't just that he lost money, it was how he lost it. He was an action junkie, someone who couldn't resist the allure of high-stakes action, whether it was at the poker table or elsewhere. He was hemorrhaging cash, and before long, it became clear. His bankroll wasn't just taking a hit, it was disappearing. And just like that, the guy who had once been on top of the poker world was now on the outside looking in. The invitations to the biggest games stopped coming, the sponsorships vanished, the bankroll was gone. Griffin didn't just go broke, he faded from the poker world almost entirely. No high-profile comebacks, no miraculous second wind. One of the game's most promising young stars simply disappeared. Another reminder that talent alone isn't enough to survive in poker. Because the truth is, poker doesn't care how many titles you've won, how much potential you have, or how big your name once was. If you don't protect what you've earned, it will disappear. And for Griffin, it disappeared faster than anyone expected. But while his story is one of quiet collapse, the next player's downfall was anything but quiet. Some players lose everything in the shadows, others do it under the brightest lights possible.
I'm starting to not feel so bad about putting me 200,000 in with my 2 queens. I'm starting not to feel so bad. I mean, I see the king 10 and the king 3.
And that brings us to the next name on the list. Gus Hansen wasn't just a poker player, he was a phenomenon. He didn't study charts, he didn't play by the book, and he certainly didn't follow conventional wisdom. He played poker like a mad scientist, mixing hyper-aggressive bluffs with unpredictable lines that left even the best players in the world second-guessing themselves. And for a time, it worked. At his peak, Hansen was one of the most feared and fascinating players in the game. He won 3 World Poker Tour titles when the tour was still in its infancy, crushing fields of seasoned pros with a style that defied logic. He was the kind of player who would cold call a free bet with 9-4 suited, hit bottom pair, and turn it into a winning hand through sheer force of will. The unpredictability made him impossible to play against. Was he making a brilliant soul read, or was he just clicking buttons? Nobody knew, and that's what made him so dangerous. But there's a reason most elite players don't play like Gus Hansen. Variance is a cruel beast, and when you're constantly putting yourself in marginal spots, eventually the math catches up to you. And for Hansen, it didn't just catch up, it ran him over. During the online poker boom, Hansen transitioned to Full Tilt's high-stakes cash games where he played against some of the best in the world. But there was a problem. The same unorthodox style that had made him a force in tournaments was now being picked apart by players who had the advantage of data, solvers, and an infinitely deeper understanding of optimal strategy. Hansen was getting called lighter, bluffed more often, and slowly but surely, his biggest weapon, his unpredictability, became his biggest liability. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of several years, Hansen lost tens of millions playing online. While most pros adjusted their approach to the new era of poker, Hansen doubled down, refusing to change the style that had once made him invincible, and that decision cost him. By the time the Full Tilt era came crashing down, Hansen's bankroll had already taken irreparable damage. He was no longer the high-stakes destroyer. He was the action player, the guy everyone wanted in the game, not because they feared him, but because they knew his aggressive style meant money was always in motion. The days of running over fields in World Poker Tour events were gone. Now, he was the one getting run over. Hansen's losses became legendary, and the poker world watched as one of its most exciting players slowly faded from relevance. But unlike some of the others on this list, Hansen never completely disappeared. He attempted comebacks, sporadically reappeared in high-stakes games, and even managed to make some deep tournament runs. But the truth was undeniable. He had lost everything that once made him special. Because poker doesn't care how fearless you are. It doesn't care how entertaining you are. It only cares about one thing, whether or not you can win. And for Gus Hansen, the game eventually passed him by. But while Hansen's downfall was brutal, he at least had the chance to lose on his own terms. Others weren't so lucky. Some players weren't just beaten by variance or outmatched by their opponents, they were taken down by something far worse. And the next player on this list knows that better than anyone. Cloutier knew how to win. In an era before solvers, before poker became a game of spreadsheets and equilibrium strategies, he was a force. He wasn't just a grinder, he was a natural. A 6-time World Series of Poker bracelet winner, a fixture in the biggest tournaments for decades, and a player who could seemingly read the game better than anyone at the table. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't reckless, he was just good. And yet, despite all the titles, all the final tables, and all the winnings, Cloutier's story isn't about how much he won, it's about how much he lost. Cloutier's downfall wasn't an overnight collapse. There was no massive scandal, no devastating downswing, no single moment that changed everything. His story was simpler, and in some ways, more tragic. He just couldn't stop gambling. Poker was Cloutier's profession, but it was never his only vice. He was a gambler in every sense of the word. Craps, sports betting, if there was action, he was in. And while plenty of pros have had their share of degenerate tendencies, Cloutier's were different. He wasn't playing for entertainment or adrenaline. He was playing because he genuinely believed he could beat the games, and in the long run, he couldn't. The cycle was brutal. Cloutier would win a massive tournament, pocket 6 figures, and within months, sometimes even weeks, it would be gone. Over and over again. No matter how much he won, it was never enough. And in the end, it left him in a position that should have been unthinkable for a player of his caliber. Broke. The poker world knew something was wrong when a rumor surfaced that Cloutier had pawned his World Series of Poker bracelet. At first, people assumed it was a joke. How could one of the greatest players in poker history need to sell one of his most prized possessions just to cover his expenses? But it was real. He had hit rock bottom, and unlike other players who found backing deals or second chances, Cloutier's prime years were behind him. There was no miracle comeback, no investor ready to stake him into the high rollers. Poker had changed, and he hadn't changed with it. Cloutier's story is a brutal reminder that in poker, winning isn't the hardest part, keeping the money is. He had the talent, the results, and a career that should have left him financially set for life. Instead, he ended up as yet another cautionary tale. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because in poker, sometimes even winning isn't enough to save you. And with that, we close the book on yet another poker pro who had it all and lost everything. But the real question is, who's next? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that poker will always find its next victim. But if you think these stories are wild, wait until you hear about the players who didn't just lose everything honestly, they were caught cheating their way to the top. From super user scandals to outright collusion, the poker world has seen its fair share of deception, and some of the biggest names in the game have been exposed. Click here to watch poker pros who got caught cheating.